Didn't say a word when Margaret Henley, the HOA president, slammed her folder on my kitchen table and demanded I vacate what she called association property. I just reached into my briefcase, pulled out the original 1847 land grant signed by the territorial governor, and watched her face go from righteous fury to confused silence. Behind her, the association's lawyer, some kid fresh out of law school who'd been throwing around words like trespassing and illegal occupation, suddenly found his shoes very interesting. The document was old, yellowed at the edges, but the state seal was still clear as day. So was my great-great-grandfather's signature, and more importantly, so was the clause that made me not just the owner of this cabin and its surrounding 40 acres, but the landlord of every single lot their precious Willowbrook Estates was built on. 6 months earlier, I'd been planning nothing more complicated than a quiet retirement. After 37 years teaching high school history in Chicago, I was ready for something simple, fixing up my grandfather's old cabin, maybe learning to fish properly, and putting some distance between myself and the endless committee meetings and administrative nonsense that had consumed my career. The cabin sat on a beautiful piece of land about 2 hours north of the city, tucked back in the woods with a small creek running through the property. I'd inherited it from my grandfather when I was 12, but between college, career, marriage, kids, and life, I'd never had time to do more than pay the property taxes and make sure the roof didn't cave in completely. Now, with my pension secured and my daughter grown and moved to California, it seemed like the perfect time to finally make use of the place. The property was exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, peaceful, isolated, and beautifully overgrown. The cabin itself needed work, but the bones were solid. My grandfather had built it himself in the 1960s, using timber from the land and following building codes that were pretty relaxed back then. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and had character. The creek provided a constant, gentle soundtrack, and the woods were thick enough that I could barely see the road from the front porch. I spent my first few weeks just cleaning up, replacing rotted boards, and getting the well pump working again. My neighbors, if you could call them that, were scattered and seemed friendly enough. I'd wave to the occasional jogger or dog walker who passed by on the old logging road that ran along the edge of my property, but mostly I enjoyed the solitude. This was exactly what I'd hoped for, a place where I could read, think, and maybe figure out what the next chapter of my life would look like. That peace lasted exactly 3 months. I was replacing some loose shingles on the cabin's roof when I heard a car door slam, followed by voices that sounded distinctly unhappy. I climbed down to find 3 people standing in my driveway, looking around like they owned the place. The woman in charge was probably in her 50s, wearing what I'd learned to recognize as the uniform of suburban authority khakis, a polo shirt with some kind of logo, and the expression of someone who'd never been told no. Behind her stood a thin man with a clipboard and a younger guy in a cheap suit who kept checking his phone. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Henley, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and informed me that I was in violation of multiple association rules and needed to remove myself and my belongings from association property immediately. I explained, as politely as I could, that this was my property, had been in my family for decades, and that I wasn't part of any homeowners association. Margaret's response was to laugh, actually laugh, and inform me that the entire area had been incorporated into Willowbrook Estates in 2018, and that all properties were now subject to association rules. She handed me a thick packet of violations. Everything from unpermitted structure modifications to failure to maintain. Landscaping standards to unauthorized vehicle storage, apparently because my old pickup truck didn't meet their aesthetic requirements. The fines totaled nearly $8,000, additional penalties accruing daily until I brought the property into compliance or vacated. I tried reasoning with them. I showed them my deed, explained the property's history, and pointed out that I'd never received any notice about joining an association or any of these supposed violations. Margaret barely glanced at my documents before dismissing them as outdated and insisting that newer county records superseded whatever old papers I might have. She gave me 30 days to comply with all violations or face legal action. The man with the clipboard turned out to be some kind of property inspector who took photos of everything: my truck, the cabin, the pile of old lumber I'd been planning to haul away, even the creek, which apparently needed permits for water feature maintenance. The lawyer, if that's what he was, served me with formal notice and handed me his card, suggesting I might want to hire my own attorney. After they left, I sat on my porch and tried to process what had just happened. I'd taught enough civics classes to know something was off about their claims, but I also knew that homeowners associations could be incredibly powerful, especially in areas where local government was weak or complicit. I decided to try the diplomatic approach first. I spent the next week researching Willowbrook Estates, tracking down their incorporation documents. In trying to understand how a homeowners association could suddenly claim authority over property predated their existence by decades, what I found was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation. The association had been created by a development company that bought up several large parcels in the area and subdivided them into luxury lots. Somehow, they'd managed to get the county to redraw the boundaries of their community to include not just the lots they'd developed, but also several existing properties, including mine. The paperwork was confusing, full of legal language and cross-references, but the basic message was clear. According to the county's current records, my property was part of Willowbrook Estates. I tried calling Margaret directly to discuss the situation. She didn't return my calls. I sent emails to the association's board, outlining my property's history and requesting a meeting to resolve the matter. The only response I got was from their lawyer, not the kid who'd served me, but a more senior partner at the same firm, informing me that the association's position was final and that any further communication should go through legal channels. I even tried showing up at one of their monthly board meetings, held in the community center of their main development. Margaret allowed me exactly 3 minutes to speak before cutting me off and informing me that my dispute was not appropriate for public discussion. The dozen or so residents in attendance looked at me like I was some kind of troublemaker, trying to bring down their property values. That's when I stopped trying to be reasonable and started getting serious about research. I took a week off from unpacking and spent it at the county courthouse, the state archives, and the local historical society. I pulled every document I could find related to my property, the surrounding area, and the legal mechanisms that allowed homeowners associations to expand their authority. What I discovered was both infuriating and fascinating. The development company that created Willowbrook Estates had used a combination of aggressive lobbying, creative legal interpretation, and what appeared to be some very cozy relationships with county officials to essentially steal authority over properties they'd never owned or developed. My land was just one of several older properties that had been absorbed into their jurisdiction through a process that seemed questionable at best and potentially illegal at worst. The more I dug, the more I realized that Margaret and her board had no idea what they'd actually gotten themselves into. The original land grant that created my property wasn't just some old deed, it was a territorial lira, a document that established not just ownership, but specific rights and responsibilities that had never been transferred or superseded. More importantly, when the state had reorganized land records in the early 1900s, my great-grandfather had been smart enough to register the property under what were then called superior title provisions, essentially meaning that his ownership took precedence over any later claims or jurisdictional changes. The property had passed through my family with that superior title intact, which meant that not only was the HOA's claim invalid, but their entire development might be built on land they had no legal right to control. I also discovered something else interesting. The development company that created Willowbrook Estates had gone bankrupt about 2 years after the association was formed. In the chaos of liquidation, many of their legal obligations and property rights had been transferred to a holding company, which had then sold various assets to pay creditors. The problem was some of those transfers appeared to be invalid, particularly the ones involving property rights that the original company had never legitimately acquired. If my research was correct, Homeowners Association was operating under authority they'd inherited from a company that had obtained that authority through fraud. By this point, it had been almost 6 weeks since Margaret's first visit, and the harassment was escalating. Someone from the association drove by my property every few days to take photos and document new violations. I received certified letters threatening legal action, fines for failure to respond to lawful orders, and even a notice that they were considering putting a lien on my property for unpaid association fees. The stress was getting to me, and I could see it was affecting the few neighbors I'd gotten to know. They'd gone from friendly waves to nervous nods to complete avoidance. Margaret had apparently been telling people that I was some kind of squatter or scam artist trying to defraud the association. The final straw came when I returned from a grocery run to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door, informing me that the association had obtained a temporary restraining order, requiring me to cease all unauthorized construction activity on the property. This was particularly galling because I'd been doing basic maintenance, fixing loose boards, cleaning gutters, and replacing a broken window. According to the notice, these activities violated association construction standards and required prior approval from their architectural review committee. I had 48 hours to halt all work and attend a compliance hearing, or face immediate legal action. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight this through their system, playing by their rules and hoping for fairness from people who'd already demonstrated they had none to offer. Instead, I was going to use the one advantage: I had time. Unlike most people dealing with HOA harassment, I was retired, had savings, and could afford to play the long game. I also had something they didn't know about: a complete understanding of the legal foundation their authority rested on. And why that foundation was built on sand? I spent the next month putting together what I privately called my nuclear option. I hired my own attorney, not some strip mall general practitioner, but a specialist in property law who'd handled similar cases, involving invalid land transfers and jurisdictional overreach. Together, we built a case that was both legally bulletproof and strategically devastating. The centerpiece was my original land grant and the superior title documentation. But we also gathered evidence of the development company's fraudulent practices, the county's failure to properly verify jurisdictional changes, and the association's harassment campaign against multiple property owners. We also discovered that I wasn't their only victim. 3 other families in the area had been subjected to similar harassment, though none had fought back as aggressively. One elderly couple had actually paid thousands in association fees and fines, rather than fight what they assumed was legitimate authority. A young family with small children had moved away entirely after months of constant violations and threats. The association was using fear and bureaucratic complexity to extract money and compliance from people who didn't know their rights or couldn't afford to fight back. The compliance hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center. Margaret had clearly expected me to either skip it or show up alone and intimidated. Instead, I arrived with my attorney, a briefcase full of documents, and a court reporter I'd hired to create an official transcript of the proceedings. The association's board, Margaret, and 4 other residents who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, sat at a folding table with their lawyer. The same kid who'd been overconfident during their first visit to my property. He looked significantly less sure of himself now. Margaret started the meeting by reading the charges against me and demanding that I explain my failure to comply with association rules. I let her finish, then stood up and asked if I could present some relevant documents for the board's consideration. What followed was probably the most satisfying 10 minutes of my entire career. I started with the original land grant, explaining its historical significance and legal weight. I moved on to the superior title documentation, walking them through the implications of state property law that most of them had never heard of. Then I presented the evidence of the development company's fraud and the county's failure to properly validate the association's expanded jurisdiction. The room went very quiet as the implications sank in. Their lawyer was furiously taking notes and occasionally whispering urgent questions to Margaret, who had gone from confident authority figure to confused and increasingly worried property owner. I finished by presenting them with a formal notice of my own demand that the association cease all harassment, withdraw all fines and liens, provide written acknowledgement that my property was not and had never been subject to their authority. I gave them 30 days to comply, the same deadline they'd given me. The aftermath was swift and thorough. Within a week, I received a letter from the association's law firm signed by a senior partner, not the kid who'd been handling the case, acknowledging the validity of my property rights and agreeing to withdraw all claims against my land. Margaret resigned as HOA president 2 days later. Citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family, the association hired a new legal team to review all their property claims and discovered that they'd been operating under invalid authority over at least 6 other properties in addition to mine. The real surprise came about a month later, when my attorney called to inform me that the county had completed its investigation into the association's questionable land acquisitions. It turned out that the development company's bankruptcy and subsequent asset transfers had invalidated most of the legal mechanisms that gave Willowbrook Estates its authority. The association would be dissolved within 60 days, and individual property owners would be responsible for creating new governance structures if they wanted them. Today, my property is quiet again. The creek still runs, the woods are still thick, and I can still barely see the road from my porch. The difference is that now, when people drive by, they do it with a healthy respect for property rights and the importance of understanding exactly what authority you're claiming to exercise. Margaret moved away about 6 months after the association dissolved, selling her house to a young couple who wave when they see me working in my garden. The other former board members nod politely when our paths cross. Though conversations tend to be brief and focused on neutral topics like weather and local sports teams, I learned something valuable from the whole experience. Something that goes beyond property law and homeowners associations. Most institutional bullying relies on the assumption that victims won't have the knowledge, resources, or persistence to fight back effectively. The bullies count on people being intimidated by official-looking documents, legal jargon, and the sheer complexity of bureaucratic systems. What they don't count on is someone with enough time and stubbornness to actually read the fine print, trace the legal foundations of their authority, and call their bluff with superior documentation and better lawyers. The cabin is finally finished now. I've got new shingles, a working well, and a small garden where I grow vegetables that don't have to meet anyone's landscaping standards. Sometimes when I'm sitting on the porch in the evening, listening to the creek and watching the sun set through the trees, I think about that moment when Margaret realized she'd picked a fight with someone who owned the land her entire development was built on. It wasn't anger or revenge that motivated me in the end. It was something simpler and more powerful. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some battles are worth fighting, especially when you're fighting them the right way. With patience, research, and the law on your side, I